My name is James Kinross. I'm a clinical lecturer in surgery at Imperial College London, and my clinical area of expertise is in colorectal surgery. And I am a laparoscopic surgeon, which means I'm a keyhole surgeon. I think design innovation has had a profound influence on the way surgeons practice their art and how we treat patients. And there is no better example for this than in the advent of keyhole surgery or minimally invasive surgery. So that's a very good example. That is only possible because of design innovation, and that has transformed the way that we treat people with colorectal cancer. When I was performing my PhD, I was asked to get involved in a research project that was designing a new crash trolley to help with the resuscitations of patients when their hearts stop. And the basic aim was to try and use design to improve the process through which this occurs. And the crash trolley is a fundamental or sort of central object around which quite a lot of activity occurs. So that was the design challenge really. It was to rethink the way we could imagine the crash trolley. My role in that project was to provide clinical expertise and to help designers understand the subtleties and complexities of the clinical problem, and then to work with them through the design process until we ultimately had a product which we could commercialise and deploy towards as part of a clinical trial. And I think clinicians quite often get involved in the clinical validation of design work, which is also where I had a role. I very much imagined it to be an adjunct to healthcare, so a separate entity that dipped in and out of the healthcare industry, solving problems when either there was a financial incentive or a very obvious gap that needed to be filled. And actually, in many ways, I had preconceptions which happily proved to be correct, which is that designers have a completely different way of thinking about problems to clinicians, and they think in a non-linear, much more creative and inventive way, and they don't bring quite a lot of the same dogma, perhaps, that clinicians bring to trying to sort out clinical problems. They're free of quite a lot of that, and that's incredibly refreshing and exciting to be around. So yeah, I did have a preconception. In many ways I was pleasantly surprised about how designers interact with healthcare professionals and the value that designers can bring to healthcare. So we had a project to build a crash trolley, and we were lucky in that we were able to secure funding to get that project formally delivered. So that funding was delivered through the Wellcome Trust, and we were able to bring a design team together. And what we did, which I think was innovative back at the time, because this must have been about 2007 when we did this, was we created a team that really integrated clinicians and designers right from the very beginning. And we took designers straight into the clinical work space, and we created, well, the first step really was to try and understand the clinical problem. And what was interesting about that was that we did that in a non-typical way for clinical academics, which is usually just to go and look at the literature and see what other people have written, and then maybe to go and look at your own institution. What we did with the design team was look at local practice from the start, and we employed some novel methods like failure modes effect analysis to try and break down what is effectively quite a complex system into different components to try and understand why design could have an impact. So we had quite a significant period of research where we really hammered out the main principles for our products and the design principles that were going to inform what we did next. And then, of course, there was a creative process where we worked through different possible solutions, and that was very enjoyable. I enjoyed that because that's it's very different to what we do normally. Once we had created a handful of possible solutions. We went through various modelling exercises and ultimately built some prototypes which we were then able to test. And we were then involved in simulation testing, so taking early prototypes into simulated clinical environments and testing them with crash teams and clinicians and getting early end user input into devices so that we could inform our design iterations, which was great. And then, of course, there was an interesting process where we were able to try and take our ideas to industry and actually get it realised into a commercial product, which we did successfully. And then we performed a clinical trial where we actually deployed the devices into the hospital. And I guess the most satisfying bit for me was actually, using them practically in hospitals, seeing them around, and hearing people talk about them and getting positive feedback from it. So we were involved in, I was lucky enough to be involved in all steps of the process actually. Designers and clinicians do think differently. I think clinicians are taught to think in a certain way, and they are taught to think in quite a rigid analytical structure. Challenging clinicians with new ideas or innovations is actually is a difficult thing to do, because quite often the natural response of a clinician is to disprove something, is to prove that it won't work, rather than to give you a positive response that will help you develop your idea or your design. Whereas designers have a much freer way of thinking about ideas, and in fact they seem to be, from my experience of working in designers at least, they're taught to think creatively and to think outside of the box. It's a bit of a cliche, but I guess it kind of describes it. You're trying to purposefully not conform to whatever the current solution or product function is, right? You're trying to think of something completely different. So that creates a natural tension. And I think if you can create a work environment that acknowledges that and capitalises on that, it can be very creative. And I think once clinicians see how productive it can be to challenge their norms, and how rapidly you can innovate and create new solutions to old problems, actually becomes very exciting. And the way really, once I was challenged to think differently and I went back into my own clinical environment, I literally felt like a set of blinkers had been taken off. And I wandered around the ward, or wandered around my clinical work environments, picking up objects that I use every day to perform tasks on patients, and thinking, well, hang on a minute, why do I have to tolerate such poor design? This product does not work. I can think of a different way of doing this. And in fact, very quickly you end up with a long list of possible design challenges. And you realise that actually, as a clinician, you have tremendous insight into these design challenges. And you just have to adopt a designer's mentality to kind of realise that. So yeah, I found there are absolutely differences between the way clinicians and designers think, and if you can tap into that, it can be extremely productive. Designers brought several benefits, both to the specific project and I think into the Department of Surgery's general approach to research. I think in terms of the project's specifics, it brought a different way of analysing a clinical problem. Right? It's a different way of thinking about solving healthcare problems on the ground. It was much more proactive, it was much more inclusive, it's much more about bringing the end users in and having an active, engaging discussion with them to find really about what the problems are on the ground as it happens. I think as clinicians, what we were quite bad at doing was recognising that 2 floors below us, while we were doing our research, was actually a thriving, very busy, complex clinical environment we could tap into and use as an essential and vital source of research, but also as more critically as a channel for translating all of our research into actual clinical benefit. And I think what researchers did, what the design group did for me, was realise the importance of that and reaching out to actually to the end user groups straight at the beginning. So I think that was very important. I think the second thing is it freed us from quite rigid academic research structures, which are important because they teach you analytical process and ways of thinking, but at the same time it can be quite restrictive. And the design group created quite an innovative environment simply by breaking down some of those barriers. And the third thing I think it did was it made me realise the importance of the social impact of the work that we do. Actually, the benefit of what we do is not to write papers and to publish papers, although that's important because you need to communicate the message, but really what's important is about the end product or whatever it is that we're doing, and putting it in the hands of the people that are going to use it and getting feedback from them and seeing it actually in its intended environment. And designers are very good at doing that. They follow that whole process through right to the very end because that's critical for them. And I think that has certainly informed the way that we do our work in our department. What we were doing was creating a crash trolley to help improve outcome from resuscitation. Resuscitation is heavily protocolized. So clinicians, when they learn how to resuscitate a patient, they learn a very, very rigid step-by-step protocol. So introducing anything into that protocol that creates change or asks them to think differently or in any way, I guess, disrupts their pattern, which they've become accustomed to, is interesting. Okay, it's interesting to observe it. And what we were able to do in that specific project was get early prototypes, early developments with designers and clinicians in a simulated environment and get them to practically experience in a safe way how suggested design innovations or design changes could influence or improve the way they perform their resuscitation according to this rigid protocol. And it was very, very interesting because we videoed it all and then we interviewed people before and afterwards. And what you saw was people's kind of skepticism and cynicism before they went into the simulated environment. We didn't tell them about the resuscitation trolley before, I don't know if you remember, before we did the experiments, we just kind of left it in the room and they had to get on with it. And then you got to kind of do a post-match analysis where we explored how design had changed what they did. We were able to show them how it changed what they did, and they were able to feedback what they liked and what they didn't like. And what was interesting about that is that once the clinicians realised that it was perhaps influencing their practice in a positive way, or they realised that they could themselves influence the future design and direction of whatever it is that they were doing, and that they could directly improve the tools that they had. It was very empowering for them, and you went from quite a cynical bunch of people dragged into an experiment to really quite a motivated and excited bunch of people that were very enthused and wanted to be part of the project, and that happened in the space of an hour or two. And that stuck with me. I really noticed that. And what was interesting about it is that the designers were there. The designers didn't leave the trolley and go away. The designers were there during the simulation, and they were there feeding back with the clinicians, and they were involved in driving the process quite a lot. And I found that to be quite important. I've learned an awful lot from working with my design colleagues. I've learned that you can challenge everything and don't accept a product that doesn't work. You can think creatively, and you can solve the problem, and you can improve the design of everyday objects we use in healthcare. And I've just learned not to tolerate stuff, and I've learned to think about everything I use as an and to consider it as whether or not it's an effective tool, whatever it is that I'm trying to do. So I've learned to challenge myself in that respect. I've learned different ways of trying to solve problems and to think about health challenges, and I've learned different ways of communicating the results and solutions that I come up with my end users. And I think academic health research really needs that. We need the engagement of our patients. That's why we're all here, and they need to know that what we're doing is relevant to what they need, and that only really happens if they're involved in every part of the process. So I think that's probably the third thing that I've really taken away from it.